Welcome to the Relationship Chronicles podcast with Nina Westbrook. Today we have Matt Higgins with us, which is very, very exciting. You may know Matt. I would say the listeners probably know you from Shark Tank, right?
Yeah,
Or best-selling author of Burn the Books.
go
But
on.
I like to start the show off each episode with a this or that, and I feel like I'm gonna know your answers to this. Maybe I
That's
won't
okay.
know a couple, so we'll get into it, and it's just like a quick this or that.
Perfect.
Okay, so joint venture or solo venture?
Solo venture.
I feel like I knew that. Night in or night out?
Night in.
Night in. Street smarts or book smarts?
Street smarts.
Smarts. Street smart.
Smarts.
Course,
Period.
of course. Um, Fake it till you make it or bow out gracefully,
Fake it till you make
for sure.
it.
Thinker or doer?
Tough. Doer.
I feel like I could have answered all of these. Everything I thought you would say, you said.
That's it? I like these questions.
That's it. I know it's
Oh,
fun.
these are fun. I want the whole podcast to be 100 of these. Because that last one was like, you know, thinking without doing is useless, so I have to say doing.
Yeah,
But I do. I am very
action.
introverted and love my time to be introspective. So I probably spend more time thinking than doing. But without the doing, thinking doesn't matter.
You gotta have action behind
Yeah,
it, behind the thoughts.
amazing.
I want you to introduce and share more about your life because one of the things that stuck out to me when we first met, you were like, I think that we have a lot in common, and my history and the way I grew up, I think you would be really interested in knowing more and learning more about. And I was like, really? And you were right. So share with us a little bit more about your upbringing and your background.
Well, first of all, I loved our conversation we had when we went deep, and so thank you for having me on. For those who don't know me, I grew up in Queens, New York, and everyone, we use these words like abject poverty. What does that really mean? But yeah, I was definitely dirt poor. Had a single mom who was progressively more disabled as I was growing up. So I used to hawk flowers on street corners and sell tickets when that was illegal to concerts. Stand in line, get paid by scalpers to do so. Handbags at flea markets, whatever it would take to make money. And so the backdrop of my life was all the dysfunction that goes along with poverty, but at the same time, watching my mom aspire for something better. And she got her GED when I was a little boy, divorced my dad, and went to community college, and then went to Queens College. So that was the backdrop. And then my early formative years were the struggle of all those issues that go along with like trying to work at an overnight deli and then go to class the next day. And I would always be desperate that the cavalry would come. And when you're a kid and you have a single mom, all you want is for somebody to come in and rescue the situation. I don't know if
Right.
a lot of single moms realize that's the psychological state often of kids,
Wow.
especially, yeah, that I would always wish the cavalry would come. And what I kept finding is one, nobody cared, and two, nobody had the full information because back then being poor wasn't cool. You get the shit kicked out of you. And so I would cover it up. So guidance counselors, teachers had no idea that my mom was literally wasting away in the room next door. So I could stop there, but I made a very radical decision when I was young, and that's what led me to writing this book.
Your backstory is so amazing. I feel like so many people can resonate with that. And so I thought it was important to kind of get a little bit of detail from your backstory. But I do want to talk about your wife
Oh,
because
good. Okay, we'll go
I
there right
know
away.
you like
Yeah,
talking about her. And
I do
I
love
feel like
talking about her.
yeah, it's great because that reminds me, your relationship and a lot of the things that you shared with me remind me so much of my relationship. You said something about, not looking for a partner who completes you, but looking for someone who elevates you, but in your own words. And I felt like that was like, hello, duh. Can you share
Yeah.
a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I love that. Well, to catch everyone up who's listening, so the story does end well. It ends bad, but ends well. And this is relevant to the partner story. I dropped out of high school when I was 16, took my GED, which again was inspired by my mother. And the whole hack was, which is the genesis of my book, was I decided to burn the boats. I was going to put myself in no position other than to sabotage my schooling, got left back 2 years in a row because everyone tried to convince me that I was crazy. And I had this idea that I would start college 2 years early. And the only way to do that was to get a GED. And so I
Wow.
literally burned the boat. So I had no option. And by the time I was 17, I went to my prom, president of the debate team, making $10 an hour instead of $3 at McDonald's. And that was the beginning of my life. In those 10 years, I went from high school dropout to the youngest press secretary to the mayor of New York. And on the day that I got my job, my mother was wasting away in a chair. I couldn't move anymore. I was giving her sponge baths. I honestly hated my life at the same time as I had this incredible professional achievement. And by the time I got to work, she died that morning. So it's insane. You know, I still living this secret life in this apartment, being raised by a single mom, and then she passed away. So we can get into the professional life. The reason why I bring that all up is like my whole life has been inspired by single moms, strong women. I've always admired. I think I have a unique vantage point about what it takes to survive. And so
Hmm.
fast forward many, many, many years later, post divorce, I went online dating app and I found my future wife
Modern
who,
love.
yeah, who I found her on. I always joke I found her on Craigslist. She's like, that's not funny. People think you're serious, but I found her on I found her on OkCupid, and I was actually looking to date a single mother. And the reason why is I wanted somebody who would understand that my kids would always come first, and somebody who would understand theirs would too. And I met this amazing person, Sarah, who, and anyone who's had their life torn apart and felt broken, which I did, and I talk about in my book, I was completely broken. Just everything changed. It was a decade ago, and together we've unleashed each other and created Shark Tank, this book, the platform, the companies that I own. I attribute so much. And so I love talking about my relationship because in a business context, we act like we're automatons, you know what I mean? That you can compartmentalize. And I always go back to politics and war. Nobody can fight a two-front war. And we are socialized to believe that we should look for somebody who completes us, when in reality, we need to believe that we're born whole and we should look for somebody who unleashes us. So I love talking about it.
Hmm.
Thank you for bringing it up because I light up obviously when I get to talk about Sarah, but
Yeah.
but my overwhelming emotion is just one of gratitude.
Wow, that's such an amazing story. I feel like learning and hearing about how intentional you've been, even being a child, the intention behind failing your classes so that you can drop out of school and get your GED. And there was one more example you use in your book, not studying for the
Oh
bar
yeah, yeah, for
or
the law. So I went to law school. Well, look, a happy life is an intentional life, right? It's very hard to be intentional because it's exhausting. You know what I mean? And you always got to audit your choices. But when I went to law school to clean up my messy little background, right? Like otherwise, I'd be doing a million podcasts to explain, hey, I'm smart. I wasn't like running with gangs, but high school
Mhm.
dropout telegraphs a lot about you. And so I made an
Mhm.
early decision. I'm gonna have to pay a heavy price for this decision, including going to law school. So I did 7 years a night of college taking care of my mother. And then I did 4 years a night going to law school. But by the time I graduated, I was making more working for the government, believe it or not, than a first year lawyer. And then I remember
Wow.
meeting with the lawyers at Skadden Arps, the hiring partners, and I was like, let me ask you a question. What happens when I beat out all my fellow colleagues? How long will it take to get promoted and run the place? And they're like, well, young man, usually around 11 years, you'll make partner. But if you're really good, maybe 8. I'm like, 8 years? It's like, so basically it's like working at McDonald's where I got to punch the time card every year and do 2,000 hours. And then I gave the money back. And I decided at that moment, I never want this to be my fallback plan. So let me follow my own advice. And I never even took the bar exam. So I'm not even licensed, even after spending 4 years. I like telling people that story because we tend to really fall victim to sunk cost fallacy. We think just because we did something, we need to rationalize it by continuing it, even if it doesn't make sense for us anymore. And
Hmm.
I use my law degree every day because it's like a PhD in philosophy.
Right.
I just never practiced. I know how not to get screwed by my lawyers. I know how not to get screwed by in a contract. I just
Right.
don't practice. And so, but yeah, highly intentional and being very intentional about my partner. And back to your relationship question, I think that's why letting people know there is another way that you could pick somebody that unleashes you.
And it's important also. I think that I've always found in my relationship just being open to things and being open to change and the idea of change, and knowing like the only thing that's gonna be constant is change. It opens you up to being able to adapt to any situation, no matter what phase of life you're in, as long as you know that it's probably not going to stay that way.
Well, you
Um,
spend a lot more time on this, but isn't that what the data shows, that the number one way to happiness is agreeability and adaptability, right? The ability to roll with things. I feel like I read a study about that somewhere.
that's really interesting. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I think adaptability, yes, but also being able to live out your dreams and live out your own life for yourself is key. A lot of people live and they're trying to do things according to other people's expectations. And it could be, expectations put on them by their families, friends, peers, whatever, the pressures of society. But when anytime you make a decision that's not for you, you stand the risk of not being happy. So, which is you started doing at such a young age, which is what's so impressive. It takes so many of us so long to understand that and to really act on that, which is the whole, I feel like, preface of your book. It kind of all comes around.
It does. I don't know where that came from. I mean, I think about that a lot. Where did the defiance come from? I think it was either partly it's nature, right? It's sort of in me. But I also think I was thinking about my mother. She died with $137 in a bank account. She had this little passbook that was her Christmas savings account. That's like what she lived for, was to try to scrounge together money. And I was like, literally died on this earth with nothing. But she bequeathed to me this never ending belief that the most grandiose thing I would ever come up with was going to work out. It's so strange. And I was like, was I indoctrinated with some kind of God complex? Like, because
Mhm.
what parent, when their kid comes home saying, I got a plan, I'm going to drop out, and be like, okay, that makes sense. Like she never
Mhm.
resisted. And so I do think my mother gave me the gift of this burn the boats mindset that
Mhm.
maybe it was inadvertent, but that let me know that to go all in is okay. And
Mhm.
I talk about this a lot on social media, that when you tell your kid that you need to have a backup plan, what you're really telling them is that you don't trust that they're actually going to achieve their dream. And
Wow.
when parents hear about my book, Burn the Boats, they're like, but what? That's so irresponsible. It's so reckless. I'm like, I didn't say burn the boats with you in it. I'm the
Mhm.
most paranoid risk taker, catastrophizer you're ever going to meet. But I
Mhm.
process the risk before I begin the journey. And I ask myself four crucial questions. Number one, what's the likelihood that the worst thing that's going to happen is going to happen? And what is that worst thing? What could it be? Right. And when
Mhm.
you do that, you say, okay, well, what's the likelihood that it's going to happen? It's usually very remote. Right. And then
Mhm.
what would I do to mitigate it? It turns out each one of us listening knows exactly what soul crushing job they would get if they didn't become the next Taylor Swift. It's not hard to figure out what crappy job you take. Right.
Mhm.
And then, but the fourth is, what would I be willing to give up in order to achieve my wildest dreams? And I've always had that kind of innate process where I've been processing the risk. I just didn't have the words to articulate it as burn the boats. And I do think that we are conditioned to think that it's much safer to just to cultivate these backup plans. And when it comes to relationships, if you have the wrong person in your foxhole, they're going to be amplifying one of two messages: go for it, babe, or
Mhm.
it's not safe.
Mhm.
And if
Mhm.
there's underlying resentment between the two of you, they may be doing it for reasons that are not pure, right?
Right.
One on the to give the benefit of the doubt, maybe it's out of their own anxiety or their projection, but if it's another way, it's out of control. Because when your
Right.
partner starts to spread their wings, you worry you're going to lose control. So I love that topic. I talk about that in business. I talk about that in Harvard Business School. I love that
Mhm.
topic.
I mean, I feel like it's such an exceptional way of thinking. It totally makes sense, and I feel like I said, most of us don't get there. But what a lot of what I'm hearing you say is also it's still bringing me back to doing the thing that makes you happy above all else. And even within your relationship, that's where when you don't do what makes you happy and you don't make decisions for yourself, that's when the resentment builds. And um, that's where the issues and the problems start to arise and play out in relationships, right? But if you're constantly doing the thing that makes you happy and you have a person who's supporting you in those decisions, everyone the theory is that everyone is then going to be happy, right? So I feel like it all relates. And I want to talk a little bit more about, there was something else we mentioned in our last conversation, but first I want to touch on this idea of financial stability. In your book, you said that when you were young, financial stability meant putting food on the table, or if you're having dinner that night. And so I want to know, how has your idea of financial stability changed over the years?
That's a great question. One, I would say it's a work in progress because when you have unreconciled trauma, which I think I have for a long time, and I'll get into why that's somewhat intentional, that you still are running from the same demons and you don't realize like those demons are gone now.
Yeah.
So for an irrationally long time, I held on to this fear that it was all going to fall apart any day now, even
Mhm.
though objectively anybody looking at the balance sheet or the bank account would say you make no sense. And it's
Mhm.
because I would still invent reasons to be running, that I can't stop. And so for a very long time, the definition didn't change. It still felt like I needed to avoid eviction court. We would go to Queens Boulevard in Jamaica. I just have all these memories of my mother pleading with the landlord not to evict us. Or remember the marshals, anyone out there listening knows those notices on your door from the sheriff
Mhm.
or from Con Edison when Con Edison would turn the electricity off. Like
Wow.
it would still feel like that could happen at any moment. I would just invent more attenuated reasons. Like, what if I had a DWI and like I ruined my reputation? It's like, well, but you don't even drink. Like, like it
Mhm.
took a long
Mhm.
time. So, but fast forward, I I have worked on that, and now I actually have gone the other direction. I try to define what I need as narrowly as possible so that my assets, broadly defined, don't become a prison of my own making. What do I mean by that? When you accumulate more stuff in life, credentials, reputation, assets, those actually make you more risk adverse because you're afraid of losing more things. You care about
Mhm.
more things, you're afraid. So I've actually worked harder as I've accumulated more to care about less and need less. And that's
Mm.
where my wife is so important because she truly is my best friend. And I think if we were deposited in a war torn place with no money, we'd have a lemonade stand, walk barefoot, and I'd be fine. So like I have my children, her, and so my relationship with money has changed. Money is now a proxy for freedom and autonomy. I want the optionality to tell everyone to go to hell if I need to.
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, I work really hard to define as little as possible that gives me freedom and optionality. And I would argue anyone listening, be very careful as you accumulate stuff. It is going that for everything you accumulate, you're going to lose a bit of your optionality because you are going to be subconsciously more risk adverse of losing it.
Wow, that's really good advice. It makes total sense. I would even add to that, this your priorities, and like it just they shift in terms of what is most important. Like, whereas finances might be important when you need to eat or when you feel like you don't know where your next meal is coming from. But I feel like once you have and accumulate all the things, like you said, it's so important to be really intentional about not placing all of your value or much value at all really in these things, because the real key and the real value is time, because that's what all of us, none of us have control over it. We don't know if we're going to be here tomorrow. And it's the most valuable thing that you have. And so, which also thank you for being here, because you're taking time out of your day.
Well,
And
thank you for having me. Like
yeah.
and to your point about money, real quick, like I do find I've had this happen too. You end up landing within a certain cohort of people, and you'll always find there's somebody with more, and you actually subconsciously start moving the goalpost on yourself, and then
Mhm.
you start minimizing. And I think
Mhm.
the way to relate to money is to always look about how it equates to autonomy, and that's
Right.
very measurable, right? Because you could simply say, I have enough money accumulated that if I maintain this run rate, I cannot work for somebody for X amount of months. And
Right.
like, and I think I would argue to anyone out there who doesn't have money and is aspiring to it, always maintain that relationship with money, because that is the bottom line, right? Like, and it's so easy to say, oh, I really want that certain Rolex or the Patek.
Right.
And it's like, no, this shit doesn't matter. What
No.
matters is the ability to tell anybody to go F themselves if you're not happy with your situation, and the ability
Exactly.
to see your children and put them to bed at night. Or and money, the other value of money, I do believe the presence of money solves the absence of money problems, and those are pretty profound, like electricity and things like that. And the ability to spend money and not really worry about it. And when I say spend money, I mean have an amazing meal out, take a vacation. That to me is immeasurable value, right? That does translate to happiness, I think.
Right.
But
Right.
more than that, stature, prestige. When people talk about money, I think it's kind of gross in terms of how much they have.
Man,
Like,
oh my
right,
goodness.
right. But money should always be measured in units of autonomy. I like that, by the way. We should come up with some formula, some
We
algebraic formula. But I don't know algebra because I dropped out of high school. So you'll
I
have to do it.
I I passed algebra, but I'm not a mathematician. I'm not great at math. So we're gonna have to I trust that you'll take care of that. Okay, that's really good. So let's continue on this topic. Um, our kids, I think they have something in common. They are not really going to grow up in the same environment or have the same experiences that we had growing up. And even from my husband, even more so when it comes to the way he grew up. But how do you instill the lessons that you've learned, and motivate your kids to take risks and, not have plan Bs, and when they have opportunities that you didn't?
Such a good question. Actually, as you were talking, I was thinking the answer lies within you. Your essence is so wonderful and empathetic and tender. I mean, I know you spend 5 minutes with you, I know exactly who you are as a human. And one of those is not like rich, alienated person. Like, that's not what you emanate, right? And I
Mhm.
think, because this comes up a lot with people who have money who didn't grow up with money. I think a lot of people who didn't grow up with money and have money and grew up under duress want to prosthetically install that duress into their kids' lives. They want to they want to manufacture it. I have friends who believe this. Actually, I would say the majority of friends who came from nothing and have a lot, they have almost like a punitive quality. And
Mhm.
my view of that is like, it's impossible to manufacture. Number one, why are you trying to? Like, what did we work for?
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm.
also inauthentic for me. There was a lot of therapy and work that had to go into unwinding what I went through.
Right.
And I would love to have grown up on third base. And as we know, third base really is more like first base because everybody has problems. So the idea that I want to manufacture to protect my kids in duress feels like subtle abuse, but also it's denying myself the victory. So
Right.
that's number one. Number two, like, I think the reason why we see children as spoiled, or we hear about spoiled children, is a lot of times parents become to relate to money as stature. And you're projecting to the world, check out my Rover, or my labels, my Gucci, whatever. Why are you wearing those labels? Where you're labeling, a lot of times it's you want people to know you're one, wealthy, and kind of feel bad. If
Right.
you don't define your own values around money, which I don't, your kids don't. And
Right.
so, like, I define my value around creativity and hard things. I take
Mhm.
pride out of writing this book, doing this show, getting to know you, like opening up, being vulnerable. I don't take it the money. It's like, it's kind of pathetic to take value out of it. And now my kids, I find, are intrinsically motivated and don't value their lives based upon things, because
Mhm.
they're now, again, I don't want to deny them the credit of being good souls, because I do think they're intrinsically motivated. But let's at least say I haven't contributed to it, because
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
nothing about my life that derives pride from wealth, because
Yeah.
I think that's sort of pathetic, because anybody can get money, you
Yeah.
know?
I agree, and I feel like I don't even know where I heard this, and I'm gonna quote somebody unknown, but like what makes a there like you can be in a room. How many times are you in a room with really, really good, like wealthy men, and or women or people, and at the same time, like how often are you in a room with really amazing, great men or women? It
No,
doesn't
it's true.
happen simultaneously
It's
because.
very, yeah. And usually, you know, I'm in awe of the people who are interesting, right? I'm
Mhm.
not. Now, money, I know that takes a lot to achieve it, so I respect it, but that's about it. Whereas and again, this is not just rhetoric. Because of what I witnessed with my mother, I know how hard it is to be a single mom, right? And I write these scholarships now for single mothers. And I do
Mhm.
these sessions with these women, and like they tell the stories of what they're doing just to survive and at the same
Mhm.
time go to college. And I remember this one woman told me this story of how she had to bring her little daughter to school at a Saturday class, and she had no babysitting, and the teacher wouldn't let the daughter stay in the room. And the she had to put her outside the room and sit in the hallway, cartooning. This is an amazing
Mhm.
story. And
Mhm.
she was telling the story about how bad she felt. And she went there to go tell her little daughter, like, I'm so sorry. And she was teary. And her
Mhm.
daughter's like, no, mommy, I'm so proud of you. I'll be good. Don't worry about me. I'm so proud. And so I was like, hearing this story and thinking, like, that is gut wrenching. So what's more interesting? Somebody who's worth a couple hundred million, which is interesting,
Mhm.
or the person who most people would surrender to the circumstance and
Right.
could barely crawl out of bed just to feed their kids, right? Or worse, or maybe submit to alcohol or whatever, right? Self-soothing. This person is both aspiring and going to get an education while working at a dead-end job and probably
Mhm.
feeling desperate half the time, right? So I guess my only point being there is no necessary corollary between wealth and interesting and exceptional. So I personally like where I derive pride is to accumulate things that money can't buy. I teach at
Right.
Harvard Business. I teach at Harvard Business School. I don't care how big your paycheck is.
Right. Right.
If you can't do it, you're not going to do it. And I wrote that book. That took 2 years, 3 years of discipline to write that book. Right? Has nothing
Mhm.
to do with money. Everything to do with perseverance and something to say. So I'm with you. This fetishization of hustle culture and making money and the flexing that goes on Instagram is, in my opinion, pathetic. Right? So it it just is. Not that I don't like nice crap, but I like it if
No,
I'm intrinsically
I
motivated. You
I
know?
totally understand. I mean, even like we're kind of raising our kids to be like more empathetic towards others. Like it's there's very little that someone else can do to ruffle my feathers. Outside of messing with my kids or messing with my husband, like I don't even care what anyone I feel like says or does as it pertains to me. But honestly, listening to your story more is really interesting because my mom was a single mom and she had 4 kids and she used to work at a telephone company growing up when I was young, and she went back to school to become a physician's assistant and create this very amazing stable life for us. But we went through a lot of time apart. She had to do residency. I remember she would sneak us into her dorm and we would use the giant swimming pool and it would be so fun. And with her dorm mate and her 4 kids spending a night. And so a lot of our stories kind of similar, and she inspired me, and I feel like a lot of the same things kind of tug at our heartstrings. But I 100% with you. I think that just raising kids to be good humans and trust themselves, and especially in today's current climate, having confidence and the instinct to kind of go for what they want and the ability to do that and how they treat people is always a priority in our home. So,
Yeah, I'm sure you can relate to this idea of seeing people around you take a totally different approach, right? Like we got to, do 100 push-ups, you know what I mean? Like I had to walk 7 miles to school, so you don't get shoes. It's like, all you're telling them to do is manufacture stress. Like it's hard enough. And by the way,
yeah.
and then growing up with wealth too creates its own problems, right? Because now this culture that we're in, we deify struggle and we deify redemption, right? Everyone on Instagram has a narrative arc. I stumbled, I've been redeemed, right? And like a lot of times those are manufactured. So everyone now has pressure to have a redemption story. And I get asked this too. Somebody asked me this. Dave Chang asked me, who I love, he's my partner. He asked me on a podcast, um, do you find yourself only looking for kids who have grit? Like to hell with the Harvard kids. And I was like, no, I don't actually, because that's inauthentic. Like the truth is I would have died to be in a normal 2-parent household. So like, why would I? And that's number one. Number two, those kids are now almost diminished in our society, right? Like everyone's kind of judged if you don't have an amazing origin story. So I feel like my GD is a weapon of mass destruction. It's almost unfair. Like I have the
Mhm.
most amazing narrative, right? And like I am very, very careful to be very respectful and empathetic to the people who didn't have that version of struggle because maybe they had a father who never said, I love you. You know
Right.
what I mean? Or never had, or now feels like they have to prove themselves, and because they were born on third base in their mind, and like, I don't know, everybody has their shit. So like, I'm
Everyone has
actually
different problems.
right, like, and to invalidate people, and to, again, back to Instagram, I do feel there's this fake narrative that is perpetuated on social where somebody went through something, they came out the other side, now they have the answers to the test, and they're standing on the mount. I'm going to render the wisdom. I always say with my book, Burn the Boats, I asterisk the shit out of it, like, because I while I feel like I have wisdom, I can't implement it half the time, and I wrote my book so I would read my book, right? And again, I think purporting to have it all figured out and also judging people that haven't struggled like you have is a disservice and lacks empathy and compassion. So my
It's
kids,
part of the whole like Instagram social media comparison thing, right? Like we either feel like we don't have a right to be upset or complain or have gone through difficult things because we did have meals growing up and vice versa. Like we are comparing each other's trauma and trying to figure out who has the worst situation. And it just doesn't make any sense to look at things in that way. You can't really, you know, conceptualize or we can't compute that for everybody. It's impossible. But this idea of um, being at the top, people do love a success story. I feel like, have you kind of ever experienced a lot of like love and support as you kind of grew, and then once you reach success, then now you have like people kind of clawing at you, and like it's kind of like people turn on you a little bit. I know it's like that in sports, but have you ever experienced anything like that?
I think there are actually what I experienced. So let's break that down. I love that question. I think I have experienced the where do you get off? Like,
Mm,
where do you get the audacity to think you could do X? So sometimes a
wow.
suspicion that you must be full of shit or fraud. Can I curse, Nina, at will? Because
Yeah,
it
you can
feels
curse,
okay.
curse.
Good, thank you. I apologize. Hide the children, but like, I have experienced the where do you get off of people who are either negative or pessimistic. They don't usually respond well to the audacity. And but
Mhm.
then that's minority, and then the majority is like, "Hey, this is fun. Really, you think we can do it? Burn the boats." And so I've
Mhm.
experienced that as I have gotten more successful, quote unquote. Actually, what I have tried to hold on to, it's part of the reason why I wrote the book. I I gave a speech to uh, homeless students at a homeless shelter in New York, and it was amazing how many of those students were being persecuted because of their sexual orientation and rejected by
Mhm.
their parents, which I did not realize, which is incredible. Right? How
Right.
sad to be rejected by your parents. And they were getting their GED in a homeless shelter. Back to this whole point of like, imagine just trying to survive and aspire at the same time. So I went to talk to them, and I said, and I came in my custom suit or whatever, however I show up in the world. And I was
Mhm.
like, so what do you guys think of me when you see me? I was like, oh, you got crazy money and you're rich. Where's your,
Yeah.
and all this stuff, right? And I remember and it's just me and them in the room. And I tell them the real story that is airbrushed in my book. Whatever you
Mhm.
read in my book, it's 10% of the truth. And at
Mhm.
the end, they're crying because they're like, really? Like I can, and they start to see themselves a little bit of me. They may be
Mhm.
black and I'm white, whatever the reasons we have separation, they see themselves, I am now possibility as opposed to difference, right?
Right.
And that's always stuck with me, that if I share the truth of my story becomes more replicable. And so
Mhm.
as I became more successful, I became more alienated from the caricature of the like guy with the suits on Shark Tank. I was like, no, that wasn't the point. I wanted to
Mhm.
collect moral authority so I could tell the codes. I could share the hack, right? And so
Right.
I guess my point to all that is I have worked really hard to pull forward the GED, the government cheese, my mother dying, the desperation. I had testicular cancer. I have one testicle. Like I have worked hard to share so that people
Right.
can meet me on my journey.
And that is so important because we connect we connect through vulnerability. That's how
Right.
we know, like you said, that's how being relatable and being able to find a way you connect with someone, no matter how different you look or how different your background is, we all share similar human experiences in one way or another. And as soon as you can like find that one experience that connects you with the next person, that's when the sparks kind of fly.
Well, that's what's been amazing about the book. Like I always say, I didn't write a book. I engineered an outcome, and it was an attempt to reach across the divide and talk to
Mhm.
somebody who felt marginalized, who felt unsupported, and had this inkling inside them, like there's more in store for me, but I don't have the
Mhm.
codes, or I'm anxious, or I'm risk adverse, or I have a partner who's undercutting me. I wanted to share this story, and hopefully, it's a little bit grandiose. And then, like, I'll get a message from somebody who's a new immigrant, a woman who connects with my story, like when you are vulnerable, people see past the superficial side and they look at the core. And every day I wake up from a DM from somebody from a completely different socioeconomic background and we meet together. And
Right.
like that takes my breath away, frankly. Like
Mhm.
even in the story, this is fun. Can we get into this? Can we get into race? So in the
Yeah.
story,
Let's do it.
so in my book, I'll tell you a great story. I had a woman, one who read it, who I love, great. She's Filipino. She read the book and she's like, "Oh my god, I love the book, but can I give you a little bit of feedback? Like when I read it, I don't totally see me, even though you profiled all these other women. There's an opening for me to be like, but you were a white male." And I was like, "Interesting." And I was like, "You don't see seen." She's like, "I love it, but like I don't." And it really sat with me thinking it would be a failure if I wrote this book and entire swath of the population would feel they had a reason to say, not me though, right?
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
and I was like, how do I tell the story in a non-cliche way? Because I do acknowledge, and I did it in two ways that I'm really proud. It's my favorite part of the whole book, to be honest. I rewrote a little bit of it, and I acknowledge the fact that as a white male, you don't represent anybody but yourself. You do not have, you do not represent gender. You don't represent a demographic. You don't represent history, right? I am completely a lone wolf, right?
It's that autonomy you were talking about earlier, right?
Right. But in the book, I was like, how do I communicate to somebody who doesn't have empathy and is tired of being told you have white privilege, or you know what I mean, feels like they're being invalidated, right? Because nobody wants to be invalidated either, or robbed of their own origin story either, right? Or
Right.
feel like they're to blame for sins, right? But so it's really tough to make people see systematic bias and racism in a way that doesn't feel punitive or like lecturing, right? So I did two things in the book. One, I profile women extensively in a non-preachy way. It just so
Mhm.
happens that my life has been surrounded by incredibly strong women, including
Mhm.
Sarah, who I owe everything to. Let me share it in a way that's magnificent. So the story opens with a black female entrepreneur, Freddie Harrell, talking about her hair extension business, not about
Mhm.
race, just Freddie. And it ends
Mhm.
with a woman who rejected my offer to join me in my firm and created her own so she could create an all-female firm to raise her daughter on her. And she sold it for tens of millions of dollars at the same time I sold my firm. That's how
Wow.
the book ends. But my point of that, I had an epic class at Harvard where at the end I was talking to two of my students, who happened to be black women, and we were talking about one of the guest lecturers, and I was like, "What did you think of that?" And they're like, "It was fine, but I could never curse like that in this classroom." And I said, "What do you mean? What's the big deal?" And he goes, "Because one, they would, if I cursed like that, they would make all sorts of assumptions about why I'm in this room and how I got here. And
Mhm.
two, I'd be ruining it for every black woman that came after me." I was like, "That is unbelievable." I want to use that in the book because even if your heart is dark, you could understand how hard that must be and how sad that a black woman feels like I'm going to be judged and two, I'm going to ruin it. And that was my way of conveying like that's not my circumstance. And so my point of the book is making that some of us we carry a heavier burden and
Right.
we have to overcome more obstacles, but the desire is still the same, right?
Right.
And the path is still the same, which is to burn the boats. And so my only point to you is when I get these reviews and somebody condemns the book, I'm like, there's the darkness, right there. Your heart is dark. For you to hear that story of me talking about a young black woman in my class who has to carry that burden, you cannot be empathetic. So anyway, I love getting those are my favorite reviews because I'm like,
Yeah.
I touched the nerve. You see
Yeah.
my point? And like, I really worked hard to try to do what I do in my Harvard classes to make sure that people felt seen and could connect with me in that book.
I want to go to your class.
I know come to the class. I had the CEO of Shopify and all these great people, but I'm
Wow.
also partners with Scarlett Johansson in her business called The
Ooh.
Outset. Exactly. But let's not stop there. And again, you could see it tends to over-index on female entrepreneurs because these are contemporary case studies, and the older case studies don't have the female entrepreneurs to the same extent, right? 20 years ago is very different than now. Bobby Brown came to show that second acts are possible
Mhm.
with Jones Road. And then drum roll, please. Kim Kardashian. We brought her
Oh,
who
that
who
is really cool. Like
who
that's
created
like
an amazing business called Skims. and which is a juggernaut. So the reason why all those came, I was making the point, anybody listening who's in business, the premise of the class this year, or the underlying theme, was that if you're going direct to consumer, you need to be a storyteller, because customer acquisition costs via just digital channels don't work anymore. They're too expensive. So you're going to spend $30 to make 20, right? But if somebody like Kim Kardashian or Bobby Brown or Scarlett Johansson or you, who's ever listening, if you are a storyteller, you can use organic reach to subsidize your acquisition costs. And it was a way to show. So anybody who was seeing is like, oh, but I'm not Kim Kardashian. All right, well, look at Bobby Brown. She's in her 60s. Or we had a whole range of, but that was the point. Storytelling is the way to unlock e-commerce. But that's my class at Harvard, which takes a very long time to put together. And back to relationships, where we began.
Yes.
The whole reason. So when I first started, one of the conditions was that I really want Sarah to be with me as my partner, my wife, because she's the one person that I could trust with making the logistics work. And it's so fun because in the room the whole time is Sarah. And she's the one bringing Kim Kardashian in and out and making the trains, planes, and automobiles run on time. And by the end of the class, everyone's like, oh my God, Sarah. You know what I mean? They see what I see. So it's so fun to be able to use that also as a forum to showcase what makes her great.
That's amazing. That's beautiful. I like that.
So anybody listening out there, one of the great parts about money and autonomy is you also get to redefine the way you interact with your spouse in the world. You don't need to succumb to these preordained, we need separation. Like, why? So when I'm on set of my TV show, Sarah's on set too. And, it's like, why not? I happen to marry a genius. So why shouldn't she be involved in everything? I remember when, in politically, the sexist subtext of whenever a first lady gets over involved, quote unquote, how people always condemn a politician, or even sometimes the woman, like, hey, you weren't elected. Like, why shouldn't, again, back to force multiplier. I think we should be looking for that in our elected officials, not condemning them for somebody stepping out of their place,
I agree. And it's happening way more often. I have so many friends who are couples partners and partners in business. They work together and they love it. Especially when you're really busy. If you can, and you really love and enjoy being with your partner, then why not spend that time together? I love working with Russell.
Well, also, here's where the resentment comes in. If you have one partner and then half your day is being invalidated because the other person's excluded from it, then you're again back to two-front war. That's exhausting. You got to shut it down. And so I do think the more you can blend, the more you can overlap, the more there's no fine line between, the happier you're going to be. It doesn't work for everybody, maybe, but I think it's easier when it does work. I was just in Indonesia. It was so fun. I was in Indonesia giving a speech to 3,000 entrepreneurs. And I was looking around the room and I was seeing about 20% of them were women. And obviously there's male hierarchical structure, right? And just women are fighting hard to be seen and heard and become entrepreneurs. And I had them all stand up. And then I had my wife stand up too. And I was saying that Sarah's not just my wife. She's my partner. She's the one you should be lobbying, by the way. But it was a great opportunity to also, when you have a relationship like that, to showcase the relationship, to inspire others to know that it's possible and that you can demand more out of
And I that's why I'm so happy that you would chat about her today, because I feel like you are absolutely right. When there's something that's working really well, like you said earlier, why not share what is it that's making it work so well, so to help inspire other people. Michelle Obama not long ago was everyone was going nuts over some comments she was making about her relationship, and and I just thought it was so interesting how everyone's perceptions or ideas over relationships are so different. But I love your approach to partnership and collaborating on even in business. I feel like we're running out of time, and I have so much.
Oh wait, but one more point. I want to make this point for all the young people out there.
2 questions for you. I still
let's do it. Well, one quick point for the young people listening out there. I think one of the challenges of relationships is because one, you don't know what's possible, and two, you don't believe you deserve it. Those are two traps I found people fall into because you don't have a lot of data or experience, right? So I think a lot of people settle and they're afraid to be intentional Why do
Mhm.
they settle? One, either they don't think it's possible, or more likely they don't feel like they deserve it. So you really have to work on yourself to feel like you deserve the best, however you define it. And two,
Mhm.
you have to be open-minded to looking at different models of relationships so you can emulate them. And don't make we make a lot of like kind of conclusions, right, about the way it's going to be, and this is as good as it gets, and I'm afraid there won't be
Mhm.
another situation. So I think anyone who is happy about their dynamics share it because there's
Right.
so much cynicism, right? And so anyway, I love having the opportunity to talk about it. Let's get to your questions. What do you
Okay.
got?
I'm gonna try to be quick. So last time we spoke, you also said something about the way you choose a business partner and how you look for the characteristic, the traits, and like their value around friendship and family as some of the main. Um, and if I'm putting words in your mouth, just tell
No,
me.
no, it's good. No,
But
no, absolutely.
yeah,
Well,
because I feel like it is so important if you're going to have a healthy business relationship, you've got to align on values in some sort of way. You
yeah,
tell me.
so let's talk about that. So there's a stat I just read the other day. It probably isn't true, but it's generally directionally true. Something like 64% of business failures are attributed to like a failed partnership. That's probably not true, but it speaks to the magnitude of the problem. So I
Right.
find this fast. At Harvard, all these students who are at Harvard Business School, they're looking to create a business. One of the things they struggle with is finding a partner. And and I find it so fascinating that they always want to know from co-founders how'd you choose each other,
Mm-hmm.
and they go into the class with the assumption that they chose a partner to fill a skill gap.
Mm-hmm.
They believe, well, I'm a numbers person, a numbers guy or girl, right? Like that's how they describe themselves. So I need a marketing person, right? They always believe that they should choose, right? And when they ask the most successful founders, like Magic Spoon's one of my investments. It's two guys, founders. This company's a rocket ship. It sells protein cereal. I'm their first investor. They ask, the answer we get from partners is always the exact same one. You want to choose people based on value alignment, because what determines the success of your business is not when you go all in on the opportunity, it's how you weather the crisis. And when you
Mm-hmm.
don't have value alignment, you will respond to the crisis in completely different ways, and that will destroy you, which I was like, that's actually brilliant. That's
Right.
number one. And the part I put in the book that I spent a lot of time with, because this is where I see most businesses fall apart, is how to determine not just whether to how to choose a partner, whether you need a partner in business.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I I
Ooh.
think, yeah. So and the way I process that is this a skill set that you could hire? Are you are you looking for a partner based on a moment of time when you feel vulnerable because you're a newcomer to the industry, which is why most people choose partners? Here's the problem. Your very desire to disrupt the industry then leads you to hire somebody from it who, after you get comfortable and you confirm the reason why you want to disrupt it, you resent the partner because the
Mm-hmm.
partner is trying to bring you back to orthodoxy. And you're like, I didn't come here to replicate. I came here to break things, right? So
Right.
it's very important to ask yourself why you need a partner in the first place. And then now, when do you need a partner is when you have a skill, you overlap on values, so you check that box most importantly, but there is a core function of the business that is outcome determinative, and you want somebody in that role who is fighting for equity, fighting to be rich, fighting for their family, and is not
Mm-hmm.
just collecting a paycheck, because
Right.
that extra 110% effort is going to make the difference. If I have a business partner and they are trying to juggle that home front, it doesn't rule them out. It means I just want to be aware to it so I can support them and we can get through it. So that's a
Mm-hmm.
long way to answer your question, but those are the different ways I
No,
look at partnership.
this is what I, this is why we're here. It's the
Okay.
relationships chronicles. And this relationship in business is so important. And I think it's underestimated and overlooked. And people don't think about it that often. Whereas this is why it's great to be sharing and hearing from you.
100%. And by the way, back to relationships and marriage, I won't delve too deeply into people's finances, but I think when you're married and you're a couple, your goal again should be everyone's vested and everyone has
Mm-hmm.
value alignment, and anything that gets in the way of one person feeling lack of vested, or wrong word, lack of ownership, and they don't feel vested in the outcome, they feel like a beneficiary in a very paternalistic way. you're actually undermining value alignment. So I would say to anybody who's a couple, what can you do to actually achieve alignment and not worry about the consequences of that? It's you know what I'm saying, but like
I do.
anything that makes your spouse feel like everything's on the line and everything is to be gained, the better and happier you'll be. And I find I'm always taken aback when people take such a defensive approach to relationships, right? This is mine and this is yours.
Yeah, it's a partnership.
Right. And the words should be ours as much as possible. Everyone can define their life the way they want, but my personal view, it works better when the word is ours and let the stakes fall where they fall.
Amazing. Okay. What is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
The best piece of advice I've ever received. I don't have a lot of regret. I don't go through self-pity. I pride myself on not being a victim. It doesn't take work. I don't feel like it. I'd much rather be the one in charge and responsible so I could fix it. Anybody out there who gravitates towards victimhood, it's fool's gold. It'll lead you nowhere. But I went through a period of feeling oppressed a little bit and like didn't know what to do. And I had a person very successful, so creative, so dynamic. And I was telling him the fact pattern. And he goes, Matt, be an agent in your own rescue. And I was like, oh God, you're so right. I am surrendering my agency. You know what I mean? I'm acting like a victim. And I always repeat to my head, whenever I feel a victim, the answer is always to be an agent in your own rescue. Being a victim is a lie because I believe we always have the last word into our last breath.
Wow. Mic drop.
Mic drop. We'll just leave it there.
We'll leave it there. We can go on. We have to do this again at some point in life.
A little bit of a plug for a book for anyone who wants to go deeper into that last
Burn
sentence.
The boat. Burn the boat.
Well, Burn the Boats. Thank you. It's available everywhere. Amazon operators are standing by. But not to plug my book, a book called Man's Search for Meaning. It was written by a Holocaust survivor. It will change your life if you haven't read it. And it's all about this idea that you get the last word to your last breath. You always get to define how you respond to things, and that will define the happiness of your life or you feeling longing and bitter and resentful. So it's an incredible book.
It's the one thing we all have control over. Like there's so many anomalies, there's so many unknowns. The only thing that we for certain have control over is ourselves. So
and how we respond to the bad things that happen. So well, thank you, Nina. It's amazing to talk to you. I'm so glad we got to continue our conversation from last time.